Welcome to Road to Redline, the #1 Porsche and Car podcast celebrating the people and the stories behind the world's finest sports cars. Road to Redline is presented by YouTuber and magazine editor Lee Sibley, serial owner and columnist Joe Williams, and 993 owner Andy Brookes, three enthusiasts on a mission to open doors and bring you the best stories, secrets and exclusives from the world of Porsche.
So, good evening, Andy.
Oh, good evening, Joe. How are you?
Yeah, very well, very well.
Well, we've lost Lee.
We have. God knows where he is. He's disappeared off into the wilderness somewhere. Yeah. Hopefully we'll catch him and get him back on for next week.
Absolutely. So, yeah, who have we got on tonight? You've organised something?
I think tonight's going to be quite exciting, actually. So we have Mike Wilds, which some may know him already, some may not. I think we've both sort of run across his path at different times. So he's quite sprightly at 75, but he's had a lifelong racing career, amongst other things. So yeah, I think it's going to be quite an interesting one.
Absolutely. I think it was the first Porsche Club Dorset meet I ever went to. I haven't been to that many, but it was the first one I went to. And Mike Wilds was doing a talk, and every other meeting that I've been to has been shit since compared to that one, because his chat was so interesting. So I think it'd be really good for the listener to find out about Mike. He's got an amazing story.
Yeah, I've actually had a bit of tuition with Mike at a couple of track days. So he regularly sits in as the resident tuition person on some of the open track events we've done with our Cayman, and a few times now he's sat in and obviously taken me around the track as well. So I've had some tuition from him, and I've also been driven by him, which is quite an interesting exercise in itself. So yeah, that's quite exciting to delve into that a bit more and get a bit more down low on the track day side of things too.
The sort of stuff that he's done in the past, I was having a quick read up. Formula Ford, Formula 3, Formula 5000.
Yeah.
A few drives in Formula 1.
Mm-hmm.
Competed in the Le Mans 24 hours.
Yeah, quite a bit of Le Mans 24-hour stuff.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting.
British touring car.
Yeah.
Obviously done a lot at Silverstone Classic.
He did a few seasons of Porsche Cup racing as well.
Yeah. And did he do that not so long ago as well, I think?
Yeah, so I think, he's been doing quite a bit of the Porsche Cup racing up to a couple of years ago. And prior to that, you're probably going back quite a few years previous to that, but he did do some time in 935 racing as well, which is quite exciting.
Excellent. And I believe he's driven a 956 quite a few times as well, which sounds amazing.
I think he's campaigning that for the current owner, around different historic racing events, which and it sounds like real bumper to bumper stuff as well. When you're talking big money historic cars here, and it's proper racing, I think.
Yeah, and he owns a G-Body Club Sport, one of my favourite cars. Quite jealous of that. If ever he wants to sell it, I think I'll be in the queue. Probably behind a few others, but yeah, absolutely fantastic car.
Yeah, definitely. So I think let's get Mike on and let's hear a bit more about him and what he's been up to.
Cool.
So Mike Wilds, welcome to Road to Redline. Obviously, you've got an extensive 50 years plus in motorsport, which is quite incredible, and hopefully we'd like to hear a little bit more about your story. So I thought we might start from the beginning almost. I mean, you come from what I think most considers to be quite a glamorous age of motorsport, especially through the 70s and things. It's very different to what it was today, and you got yourself on that grid, from nowhere without a big pot of money to do it. And can you give us a quick rundown of what that was like, or how you even got there?
Yeah, of course. Hello, everybody, and thank you for asking me to do this. It was all down to a garage in Chiswick in West London. As a young schoolboy, my brother was racing motorcycles, and I suppose that's where I got the sort of racing bug from. I used to go and watch Johnny, my brother, race, and I passed a garage called the Checkered Flag, and I used to put my nose against the window and there were all sorts of cars, the Lotus Elites and D-type Jaguars and so on, and they fascinated me, and I was drawn towards four wheels rather than two wheels. I spent so much time parking my bicycle outside their showroom and looking through the windows. They invited me in and gave me a Saturday job washing cars.
Brilliant.
And it stemmed from there. They had a racing team. They raced Gemini Formula Juniors that they built themselves. They invited me to a race meeting. I stepped out of the truck. Eureka, a huge moment. This is what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. And it was a struggle for a family with no money and to actually make it happen.
Must have been quite a supportive family around you at the time, because I mean, getting into motorsport is difficult. Yeah, for every walk of life, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it was different. It was different then. It was easier because motor racing was a sport rather than a business that it is now. I could go and drive for lots of teams if I just sign a check and there you go, I'm a racing driver driving for this team.
Yeah.
In my day, I had no money. So eventually I worked, when I left school, my father was a photographer. So he insisted I get an apprenticeship for my future. So I went into Fleet Street as an apprentice photographer, and I still do love taking photographs to this day. But as long as I was there, all I was thinking was how can I get out of this to go and work at the checker flag or somehow get close to motorsport. And I wanted to do it. So I worked in a public house. I think it was called the King's Head in Kew, on Kew Green. And I used to finish work, get home, go there, work in the evenings, and I started to save money. And I saved and saved and saved. I joined the 750 Motor Club, and this is in a very condensed form. I'd saved enough money really for a deposit on a car. And at the 750 Motor Club, I met a man called Lou Bergonzi. He had a little DRW Mark I. It was like a Lotus 7. And it had an 1172 side valve engine, and he was racing it in the 750 Motor Club 1172 Formula races. He wanted to sell it to move on. He wanted £280 for it, including the trailer. Mm-hmm. I had probably £60. I went and spoke to my parents. They couldn't lend me any money, but what they were willing to do was to stand guarantor for a loan. So I borrowed the rest, and one December night, I paid Lou his £280, and it was parked outside our flats where we lived, covered in a tarpaulin. I hadn't really thought about it because I didn't have a road car. So
nothing to tow it with.
What was I going to do? So we actually fitted a tow hitch to my mother's Morris Minor 1000 eventually. And it sat there until, that was probably on an October-November night. And I went and did a sprint in it at Brands Hatch. That was 1964. Very early 1965, I did a sprint to see how I would get on. And I was terrible. I spun twice.
Was that was your first time in a car that you just turned up and off you went?
Well, to be honest, I did go to Silverstone. When Lou agreed to sell it to me, he said, you ought to see if it's okay. So I went to Silverstone with my father, and I did drive it around the club circuit. I hadn't got a clue what I was doing. So he took me in the passenger seat, which seemed perfectly acceptable in those days, and he drove me around and showed me Silverstone. But that was it. And then I went to Brands, spun twice. My father was packing up the toolbox to go home. But I did complete the sprint, and it wasn't so bad. And then in May 1965, I went to Snetterton for my first race with the 750 Motor Club, which was unbelievably fun.
So that's nearly a year later then, is it?
Well, no, I bought the car in late 1964.
Yeah.
So that was May 1965.
Okay, yeah. So lots of prepping over the winter.
Well, yeah, my father was a professional photographer in Fleet Street, but his passion was fiddling with cars. He always used to
wonderful.
decoat my mother's Morris Minor 1000, and I'd help him.
Yeah.
And he was wonderful. I never really got on with my father in my early teens. But the motor car brought us together. We were absolutely, I had a wonderful relationship with my father as soon as I showed an interest in this car. And he helped me all he could. He couldn't help me financially, but he would help me prep the car. And I wouldn't have got on without his help. So we went to Snetterton. We had to leave the night before because Mum's car wouldn't tow more than 30 miles an hour with the trailer on the back. Wow. So we drove through the night to Snetterton. People showed me what to do, go and sign over there. And I made so many friends that day. Go to scrutineering, listen for the call for practice and what you should do is this, that, and that. Everybody was so helpful. And I went out and practiced to come back to wonder how I'd got on, to find out that the timekeepers hadn't turned up. So they just did a grid by ballot and I was put somewhere in the middle of the grid. I was feeling very sick with nerves. Went out there. We had no seat belts or anything like that. Just jumped out of the car, said to my dad, he said, I think that man over there will drop a flag and off you go. And when you see one with a checkered flag, that's the end of it. So I went off, sat in the car, had a fantastic dice. I can remember his name now, Cyril Lyford from Newark. He had a little 1172 special with a magnificent dice. But the funny thing was that somehow I got the most amazing start. I saw the man drop the flag. I had a little 3-speed Wooler close ratio gearbox in the car. I dropped the clutch. And when I got to Rich's, there was nobody in front of me, which was really weird. And I was a bit worried about this. So I for some reason, I didn't look in the mirror. I turned and looked over my shoulder to see all these cars bearing down on me because I put the brakes on far too early. And I was back in the midfield again. But I had a dice with Cyril. I eventually managed to finish third in my first race, which I was chuffed to bits about. I've got somewhere in this office, I have an egg cup sized trophy that I won. And it was great. Driving home that night, I was on cloud 9.
I bet you were buzzing.
And I raced every time I could save up to race. So some months later, I entered a race at Silverstone for the 1172 Formula. This time I came second. So things were progressing. Because I had been round Silverstone before. I knew it, but I hadn't been round Snetterton.
Yeah.
And I saved up some more money, entered another race at Silverstone and won that one.
Wow. Good. So 3-2-1 in your first 3
That's
races.
Right. Yeah,
amazing.
The next 50 odd years were downhill.
Brilliant.
I think you had quite a quick sort of leap and a jump, from that first experience of racing to in quite a short amount of time. I mean, you were working your way through is it Formula 3, Formula 2, 5,000, and then into some Formula 1 stuff as well?
Sure. I raced that car 7 times that year when I could afford to do it, and I was invited to the 750 Motor Club's dinner dance, and I didn't particularly want to go, but my mother and father, for some reason, yes, you must come. Yes, we're going. You must come. You must come. So I went because the 750 Motor Club had already told my parents that I'd won something called the Mike Air Trophy for the best newcomer to motor racing. So it was lovely to go there, get an award, and as I walked back to the table, my mum and dad standing up clapping with a bottle of champagne. It was just the best feeling ever.
I bet they were so proud.
Yes. So I was all up for it for 1966. I'm going to go for this, and got to Brands Hatch and doing well, up in the top 3. A man called Pete Lokeman spun in front of me, and I thought, great, I got second place. He spun at paddock, and I thought he was going to spin to the infield. But sadly, as I stayed flat down the hill, he spun but came backwards and pushed me on the grass, and I hit the barrier with no, it was an earth bank. There was no arm cone those days. Yeah. With no seatbelt, the car rolled. Luckily, as it hit the bank, my head hit the ignition and fuel pump switch and turned it all off. So when it inverted, I was unconscious, but it snapped my pelvis in half and it broke all my ribs, broke my arms, and I woke up about a week later in quite a state.
Oh my word.
So it basically wrote the car off, and I was taken off to West Hill Hospital in Dartford, where I stayed for many, many, many months. But my father, bless his heart, all these wonderful people in the 750 Motor Club all got together and they repaired the chassis and so on. And my father used to tow from Chiswick in West London to the hospital in Dartford. If he parked in a particular corner of the car park, I could see the car on the trailer. And he would show me and explain how the rebuild was going and so on, because I was obviously still very keen to get back in the car as soon as I got out. Again, cutting it very short, I raced it a fair few times after that, but I had so many debts, I had to sell it, and that was the only racing car I've ever owned.
I think you must be quite brave to get back in the seat. I mean, after a crash like that, to have the nerves to go again and get back on the horse is quite something, surely.
I think if you're a racing driver, I don't think you have that kind of mindset. I played rugby. My favourite sport was rugby. I loved playing rugby, but I knew every time I ran on the pitch, some bugger was going to hurt me. But it didn't stop me wanting to go and play rugby. And I think it's the same mindset. It's not going to happen to me, but once or twice in my career, it did happen to me, and I got very, very badly hurt. But never once did I ever think, I don't want to get back in a racing car. But that's how it was. So I had to sell it. I wanted to work in motor racing so I could keep with motor racing people, and hopefully somebody would let me drive their car one day. And again, cutting it all very, very short, I spoke to people. I wanted to get into single-seaters. I joined a local company. Brentford was next door to Chiswick, and in Brentford there was Firestone Tire and Rubber Company. And so I went there and said, look, you have a racing division. Do you have any jobs? No, we don't. But if you're that keen, we'll give you a job in another part of the factory. And when we do get an opening for a race tire engineer or whatever, we'll bring you over. And true to their word, I went off in the export department doing paperwork for exporting Firestone tires. And one day I called into the office. There's a position as operations manager for the European racing division. Would you like to go for the interview? So I did, and they took me on. Quite why? Because I had absolutely no idea about race tire production and how I was now operating manager, how I was supposed to link production for Formula One tires, for sports car tires, to the schedules of the races, organise the transport of the trucks to go to all the Grand Prix and the sports car races. It was sensational, but luckily I clicked with it. And when they were short of race tire engineers, suddenly I was at Le Mans, and I was at Spa, and I was working with Pedro Rodriguez and all Scarfiotti and Mike Parks, and I was doing tyre temperatures for their Ferraris and Porsche 917s later on, and it was a magnificent job. I loved it, and it kept me in with people in motor racing.
Yeah.
I met a man called Pat Longhurst who had a Formula 4, and he said, well, I've got a couple. If you want to run one, I'll let you borrow it. Again, it's very short. So he lent me a Formula 4 car with a trailer. Had a Hillman impenge in it, 1 litre, and I raced that for a year. And again, I was meeting people, other people racing Formula 4. I was so into it, and I so wanted to win. Pat Longhurst had a partner called Bob Jarvis, who also had a Formula 4. We went to Ingliston to race these cars in the wet, and I was running second, and they gave you prize money at Ingliston, and the prize money for first place was quite a lot more than second place. I totally never thought that the man I was trying to overtake actually owned my racing car. So, as we got to the last corner,
No team orders.
I just inadvertently touched his rear right-hand wheel with my front. He went into a half spin. I went through and won and was overjoyed because now I could afford the petrol to get from Ingleson back home. And they took the car off me there and then, so I was out of a drive again.
Yeah, nice trophy.
Yes. Well, I had the money to drive home, which was cool. So one of the other guys, John Cavell, who played a huge part in me becoming a professional racing driver, was racing Formula 4. And he said, "Oh, don't worry, Mike." He said, "You can come and have a go in my car." His father, Jack, was a wonderful man I got on with, and I raced John's car off and on. And one day, John came up to me at Mallory Park. We were racing. And he said, "Mike," he said, "I'm so far off the pace. You're on pole position. I can't seem to get Gerard's corner," which, for those who don't know, Gerard's is a very long radius right-hand corner. Within the little 1 litre Hillman engine single seaters, I could do it absolutely flat in top. Just go in flat in top and come out flat in top. In fact, the hairpin was the only time where I wasn't flat in top. We braked and came down to second gear, around the hairpin, back up to top, and it was flat all the way until you got back round there again. So John said, "Where do you brake and change down for Gerard's?" And I said, "John, you don't brake or change down for Gerard's. You go in flat." So John went over to his father. He said, "Dad, I'm obviously not meant to be a racing driver." And again, cutting the story very short, he said to his father, "If I don't drive, would you help Mike instead of me?" And I would feel he would get the enjoyment out of watching his father help me, which is incredible. And we're still best friends to this day. And so I went through a period of Formula Ford, a year with Formula Ford, before Jack actually decided that he would buy me a Formula 3 car. I'd made friends with a man called Sheridan Thin. Sheridan was, he actually ended up being commercial manager for Williams Grand Prix. But he had a Titan Mark IV Formula Ford that he bought and let one of his cousins, Richard Cardew, race. Richard wasn't interested. I think Sherry had seen me race the Formula 4. And so he said, "You can have the car and the trailer. Give it back to me in a year's time." Wow. So John and Jack offered to help me run the car, but I still didn't have any money. They wouldn't put any money in. So I went to the PR department at Firestone and said, "Would you help me?" They said, "Not a chance." And I wanted to do the European Formula 4 Championship. I didn't want to do anything parochial. I really wanted to get into international motor racing.
Yeah.
The PR man telephoned me. He said, "I've got an idea. We supply all Formula 1 teams and sports car teams with jackets, and they're made by a company called Skyjump. I'm just about to put an order in for a huge amount of these red Firestone jackets and racing overalls for Ferrari and Surtees and all these people. What I'll do is I'll say, you can have this order, but you have to help Mike." So they gave me a budget to do, not a big budget, it was less than £1,000, to do the European Formula 4 Championship. And I managed to do the whole championship on this £800 or £900 that it was. Yeah. And all I had to do was put Skyjump, their company, on the side of the Formula 4, which I did. And I borrowed, there was a man called Pete Lovely I met. He was an American, ran in Formula 1 as a privateer. And he had a little Volkswagen flatbed that he used to carry this Lotus 49 that he bought around to the Grand Prix. And he used to lend it to me to transport my little Formula 4, which was very, very nice of him. And so that's what I did with the Formula 4. Then I gave the car back to Sherry, and he eventually became Nigel Mansell's manager, I think, as well. Wow. He died recently. Lovely man, very enthusiastic for young drivers to help them. Jack Cavell said that he would buy a new Formula 3 car, or buy a Formula 3 car for me to race in. The Formula 4 was 1971, 1972. If you want to do Formula 3, I'll buy a car, but you've got to run it. You've got to find the money to run it. So he bought James Hunt's March 713S that he'd been racing with Rose Bearing sponsorship. So we got the car, and I still didn't have money. Jack said, "Okay, well, I'll pay for a few races." And we went off to Thruxton for the first race. And suddenly, I was taking advice for gear ratios and so on. I was dicing with people like Jochen Mass and Ricky Von Opel and all these people. And I remember Ricky Von Opel coming up to me after the race and saying, "You." So I said, "Yes." He said, "You, I will have to watch."
So how old are you at this time, Mike? So you're
in 72, I was 23.
Oh yes, so still relatively young.
And I did another race at Silverstone and went very well. And Jack said, "I'm going to buy a new car." And he ordered an Ensign from No1, an LNF3. And Jack sold the March to a hill climber. I think David Franklin bought it. And I was still meeting people through Firestone. And I'd met a man called Jeremy Sumner who had a Chevron B6 BMW. I kept on it. "I'd love to race in your Chevron. Can I have a race in your, please, can I have a race in your Chevron?" It was always no. But eventually he said, "Well, look, there's a race I'm doing, a GT race at Brands Hatch. There's a Formula Libre race. If you want to do the Formula Libre race in my Chevron, you can do it. I'll enter you, but if you bend it, you have to pay for mending it and so on." And yes, no problem at all. Yes, I'll do that. And we went off to Brands Hatch. Jeremy won the GT race, which was fantastic. I hadn't ever driven the car. So we went off in practice, and I was the only GT car in the Libre race. There were Formula 3s and Formula 2s and all sorts of single-seaters with me in this Chevron plonked in the middle of the grid. It rained, and I couldn't believe my luck, really, because for some reason, rain doesn't bother me, and I seem to be quite quick in the rain. So the race starts, and we go off, and suddenly the checkered flag's out, and I've won the Royal Tunbridge Wells Trophy Formula Libre race in
a GT car.
Jeremy's GT car. He couldn't believe it. He was absolutely over the moon. And we'd obviously talked during the day. "Well, I've got this Formula 3 car, but I can't drive it because I've got no money to ride. I have to help you. I have to help you." So it was a day the Chevron changed my life, because Jeremy introduced me to a company called Dempster Developments, who were very keen to get involved in motor racing. And Jeremy arranged for me to meet them at the Hilton Hotel in London. And I went along there, met Colin Phillips and Sidney Pierce, who owned the company, and the Sid Cup in Kent. And they said, "What did you want to do?" I said, "Well, I want to do Formula 3 racing. We've got the car. We'll need to get a mechanic, and I think we can organise a transporter. But we need money to run the car." And I'd done some calculations. The problem was, at the time, Formula 3 was so competitive and so popular. There were 3 championships. You had 2 British championships, the Forward Trust and the Lombard North Central Championship. And you had a John Player European Championship. I want to do them all. How I was going to do them all, I don't know, because it was like 100 races in a year, because you were doing heats and finals and so on and so forth.
And you're still working at Firestone at this time, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. How did you do that?
Well, I hadn't even thought of it. All I wanted to do was go motor racing.
Yeah.
And I'd worked out it would take about £35,000 to do all this. Now, £35,000 back then is probably £500,000 now.
Mm.
So it was a lot of money. And they just said yes. And I said, really?
Wow.
Yes. Put it all in writing. Let's do this. Let's go for this. But if we do this, you have to give 100% to this, and you have to give up work. I said, well, I have by that time I was married to Chrissy and we wanted children. I said, I have obligations. I can't just give up work. No. We'll pay you a wage to be our racing driver. So they paid me £60 a week. Well, my flat in Chiswick was costing me about £20 a month at the time. So it was great. I was getting sick. But now, Christ, I've got the best job in the world at Firestone. What am I going to do? So I went back and talked to Chrissy and I said, look, can I do this? I don't know whether I'm going to be successful enough to keep a drive and earn money.
Yeah.
Whereas I have a secure job with Firestone.
Yeah.
So I thought. So she said, no, you've got to go with your dream, bless her heart. So I resigned from Firestone and I became a professional racing driver for Dempster Development. And I drove Formula 3 in 72 and 73 for them. The end time was good. I never won a race in it, but I was always in the top 3 or 4.
Competitive then?
Ish, yeah. And it really was, I was racing against the Lafitte's and Alan Jones, Tony Bryces of the world. But I couldn't quite get the ensign, so much so that at Monaco, we cut tubes out of the engine frame because the car was too good. It was too stiff. So the small control tyres were having to do too much for it. So we cut tubes out to try and make the chassis flex and so on. So in the end, we said, no, March 7, eventually 733 Marches were the car to have. So Dempster's bought one. And suddenly I was winning motor races. I went to Mallory Park for a European round. And I beat all the French and the Alan Joneses and the Jacques Lafitte's and what have you. And suddenly I was winning motor races. I won at Croft, new lap record and so on. And Dempster were very happy. And I was now overjoyed to be paid to do my passion.
It's living the dream, surely.
Yeah, absolutely. And then at the end of 73, it was, well, what do we do now? I said, well, we must go Formula 2, European Championships, the last step I need to get to my ambition of being in Formula 1.
Yeah.
Right, you put the budget together, show us what's what and so on. So I presented it all to Dempster. I said, but there's only 2 races in England. And I said, well, yeah, it's a European chair at the most. No, we've got to have more races in this country. So back to the drawing board, what do we do? The only thing I could think of that could be a good stepping stone to Formula 1 would be Formula 5000, because they had lots of power. They used Formula 1 tyres and so on. So I presented a budget for Formula 5000 and they said yes. And I wanted to get a Lola T332, which seemed to be the car to have. Brian Redman was driving one. David Hobbs was driving one. Peter Gethin and Teddy Paulette were in Chevrons. But I always heard I wanted to go the Lola route. But sadly, because we were running a March, Max Mosley telephoned Dempster and said, what you need is one of our 741 Formula 1 cars. And we will put a Chevrolet engine in the back and it'll be a semi-works effort and off we go. So they did. They bought a March 741 and then March were too busy to fit the engine. So when I was racing Formula 4, nice little story, back in 1970, I was trying so hard in qualifying at Snetterton that I spun and hit the bank backwards and it broke the chassis. So I was very depressed, and I was pushing the car on the trailer to go home when a man came up to me and said, "You going home?" I said, "Yeah." Sadly, I went off and I've broken the chassis. "Really? Let's have a look." And this chap had a look. He said, No, come on, get it off the trailer. I'll repair that for you. And we pushed it over to the Jim Russell Racing Drivers School workshops. And inside was Emerson Fittipaldi's Lotus 69 Formula 2. And this man was Emerson's mechanic in Formula 2, and he was just at the race meeting. And he repaired the chassis for me, put string around it, set it all up for me again, and got me out in the race. Wouldn't accept any money for it or anything. His name was Colin Bennett. And Colin Bennett, eventually, when I'd become professional, we were looking for mechanics. We became friends. I got him to work for me in Formula 3, Formula 5000, and so on. And I did a lot of testing for him. He now runs a huge historic racing company where he and his sons run lots of Formula 1 cars and so on. And I used to do lots of testing for him. So anyway, Colin then had to do all the modifications himself to fit this 5-litre Chevy in the back of the March, which he did really successfully. And we started to race that. It was a bit of an eye-opener when we went to Silverstone and I first put my foot to the floor with this 5-litre monster thing on the back. And
that's a bit of a jump in power for you.
Yeah, you used to Hillman imp engines.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, the Formula 3s probably had 120, 130 brake horsepower, but suddenly I was at 530 brake horsepower. And it was a bit of an eye-opener. We did a test at Silverstone, and it was going pretty well. So we went to Brands Hatch Grand Prix circuit for the first race, and I qualified way down about 11th or 12th place, I suppose. And I'd never done a start in it. So as we went off for the race, I put it in first gear and just stood still, wheel spin. And I eventually got in. It was quite a long race. I eventually got into this car and really started to make some progress. I overtook the likes of Ian Ashley, and eventually caught Peter Gethin was leading in the Chevron, Brian Redman was second, and suddenly I found myself in third place. And I then overtook Brian, and Brian then overtook me, and I learned so much in those 30, 40 laps, whatever it was, because I was barreling down the inside and getting the corner all wrong, and Brian would just drive past on the way out, looking at me and say, "What are you doing?" But anyway, the upshot was I finished second to Peter Gethin in my first 5,000 race, which was really tremendous. I was over the moon. March were over the moon.
Must have raised a few eyebrows if you sort of rocked up for your first race and
yes.
came back with second. I mean, that's, yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty good. And we went to Mallory Park for the second race. We were 5,000 around Mallory Park's a bit scary, really. And I finished second again. But this time I think I finished second to David Hobbs in the Lola. But it was amazing how suddenly people wanted to talk to me. And as it went on, I was still I got pole position at Brands Hatch in front of everybody, in front of all my heroes, Brian Redman and David Hobbs, Peter Gethin. I couldn't, because Peter at that time was a Formula 1 driver and the winner of the fastest Grand Prix ever at Monza. And there I was kicking him off pole position at Brands Hatch. So
fantastic.
It was good for my confidence because I've always been a fairly underconfident person. So it was good to sit there on pole, even though I was shitting myself. And I had a great race. I didn't win, but it was probably one of the best drives I've ever done in a racing car. I set off and I was leading quite comfortably, and I started to lose the brakes. I started to lose front brakes. I only had rear brakes, and naturally it slowed my lap times, and I got overtaken by Teddy Collette, Peter Gethin, David Hobbs and all the boys. And I was running in 6th place. And I thought, well, if I could just keep this going, it was 60-lap race, I think. And it was very difficult with only rear brakes to then have the throttle stick open. Which was really, with no brakes and the throttle stuck wide open, was not a good combination.
No.
But the March had a kill switch on the steering wheel. So all I did was keep it in a high gear, so hopefully would limit the wheel spin. And I was braking early and was coasting in the corner and then just firing the engine with the switch on the steering wheel off towards the next corner. And I finished 6th in that race, and I reckon it was the best race I ever drove in my life.
Jesus Christ!
I should have just stopped. But anyway, we carried on, and I was doing quite well in the championship. Well, after the first 2 rounds, I was leading the European Championship. But we got to Thruxton, and they're wild. Formula 5000s around Thruxton are wild because it's so fast.
Yeah.
And I was lapping a man called Tony Dean. I was running, I think, second to Bob Evans, who was in a Lola. And as I came up the straight, came through the last corner of church, I think it is, up towards the chicane, I went to overtake Tony Dean on the right-hand side. He was on the left-hand side. So to me, it just seemed I was doing 170, 180 miles an hour. And as I went past, Tony, some reason, came across and hit my back wheel. And it put me into 170 mile an hour spin all the way up towards the chicane until I hit the barrier. And I didn't take my hands off the steering wheel. I kept fighting to try and save the car. And when it hit the barrier, it snapped my left wrist. And that very week, I'd been asked by March to do my first Grand Prix in Sweden as a replacement for Hans Stuck, who'd broken his thumb at Monaco. So I was gutted because I'd lost my first Formula One opportunity, and I then couldn't drive the 5000 for a while because of my broken wrist. So it was decided I did race it again, but the championship was gone. So Dempster sort of pulled out and sold the car. But the upshot was that I had a call from Mo Nunn, who Vern Schuppen was driving his Formula One car. And Vern was leaving because the car really wasn't very good. But to me, it was a Formula One car.
Yeah.
Drive. And I went to Austria, I went to Italy, and I went to Canada. And I couldn't qualify the car. And one of the main reasons was that every time you turn the car into a left-hand corner, it lost fuel pressure. And it was very competitive. You had 30 cars for 25 places on the grid. So you had to be on the pace to get in the race. And it was getting very frustrating, and I was getting very upset that I couldn't qualify, and it wasn't really good for my confidence again. So, bless his heart, between Canada and the American Grand Prix at Watkins Glen in 1974, Mo said, I'm going to take the whole car apart. I'm going to rebuild the whole fuel system and so on, which he did. And we got to Watkins Glen, and lo and behold, I qualified. I qualified at the back. I qualified 22nd out of 25, but it was really 22nd out of 30 because people like Tim Schenken in the works, Lotus 72, didn't qualify. Vittorio Brambilla in the works, March, didn't qualify. And I was next to Graham Hill on the grid. Okay, Graham was at the end of his career, and but crumbs, I was sitting next to Graham Hill, and in front of me in Lotus 72, chassis number 6, was Ronnie Peterson, who was my hero. And I couldn't believe, here I was sitting on a grid of a Grand Prix with really all my heroes. And then it all went wrong again.
Oh, no.
I was waiting for I did the warm-up lap, came round, sat on the grid, and the fuel system played up yet again. But it wasn't actually the system. It was the pressure relief valve on the Cosworth V8. On the DFV, it has a high-pressure fuel injection system, and the pressure relief valve for the fuel injection packed up, and the engine wouldn't run properly. So when he dropped the flag, the car, I couldn't get the revs up. And so I staggered off the grid, and they'd lapped me, I think, 4 or 5 times by the time I could get it round to the pits. I didn't want to retire. So I managed to get it round to the pits. It took about another 3 or 4 laps for them to find a pressure relief valve. So in the end, I went out, Mo Nunn said, just go out, get some experience.
Yeah.
So I drove round and round. I had a dice with one of my dear friends, Chris Amon from New Zealand. He was in the BRM. And we had some fun. I finished 14th, unclassified because I hadn't done enough laps.
Yeah.
But I'd done a Grand Prix, which was sort of achieving an ambition. And the upshot of driving against Chris Amon was that Chris was leaving BRM at the end of the season. And I had the call from Louis Stanley, would I be interested in driving for BRM in 1975, which was sadly another disaster.
What did so where did it go? Did it go somewhere with BRM, or was that a non-starter in the end?
It basically, I had this very strange series of meetings with Louis Stanley. He had a permanent suite in the Dorchester in London in Park Lane, and he asked me to have a meeting. So it was quite handy from Chiswick. It was only 15 minutes down the road. So I went there, and he said he'd never heard of me, but he saw me at Watkins Glen and he thought I drove pretty well. Would I be interested? And I said, yes, of course I'd be interested. I'd also been talking to John Surtees, and I had actually done some testing for John Surtees. He was very keen to run me because during a test session, he'd had Henri Pescarolo come along at Goodwood. And I ended up nearly 2 seconds a lap quicker than Pescarolo. But anyway, he said he couldn't afford to run me. So when I was talking to Mr. Stanley, he said, I'd like you to drive for us. He said, I will pay you £500 per World Championship point that you score. But you can't go water skiing. He asked me what my hobbies were. And I said, I like water skiing and I like riding motorbikes. And so everything was banned. But I won't pay you. I said, but you'll pay me prize money if I get points, but you won't pay me a wage. And he said, no. So I said, well, I have a wife, and Chrissy was pregnant with her first child then. I have to go away and think about this because I have to get some wages somewhere.
Yeah.
So I went away and I went and talked to my friends, Colin and Sid at Dempster. I said, look, I've got this Formula One drive, but he won't pay me. Would you help me? And they agreed. They pay it. They said, okay, we'll put you on the payroll and we'll pay you. You go and drive to BRM.
Wow.
It was really nice on them. And I went testing with Chris Amon at Snetterton. He had the P201 and they brought along a P160 for me, and I drove that. It was a wonderful, the P160 was the nicest single-seater at that time I'd ever driven. It was sensational. And then little V12 in the back singing around 12,500 RPM was wonderful. Towards the end of the day, Chris said he had to go. And he disappeared, and they said, right, well, you can now have a go in the P201. So I drove the P201. It seemed fantastic. The only thing I was concerned about was it was frying my ankles because it had inboard front brakes, which were right next to your feet. And I can't tell you how hot it was with the brakes being right next to your ankles. And I went round and round, and I was going pretty well. I was probably going as well as Chris had gone in the car. until I came out onto the pit straight on one lap in top gear, pulling hard when two Conrods came over the block. And I coasted to a stop, and they all came over, and this is not very good. I said, well, I didn't exceed any of the rev limits and so on. Telltale was okay. And they said, oh, don't worry, we'll get this sorted. I thought, great, Formula One, this is great. They'll sort the engines. So off I went. I went to the racing car show at the beginning of the end of 1974. We flew out to Argentina on the 7th of January, my birthday, in 1975, to do the Argentinian Grand Prix. But at the racing car show, I was chatting with James Hunt, who I'd become friendly with. And he had his beautiful wife, Susie, there. And he asked me if I would be her travel companion to Argentina because he had to come out late. That was a real tough gig. Really. If she was absolutely stunning. So it was quite nice to sit next to her all the way to Argentina. So anyway, we get there, and I don't know, I tend to like to understand the cars that I'm racing. So I had a good look around the car at Snetterton. And when I got into the paddock in Buenos Aires, I looked at the car, I looked at the engine, and it was the same engine I'd blown up in Snetterton. They'd welded the block.
Oh, my God.
And I said, really? I said, we're revving this engine to 12.5 and you've welded the block. There's not a chance that engine will survive. Yes. Of course, they were struggling financially. So there was a lack of engines. We did have a spare, but they reckoned the best one was the one that was in the car that had the block welded. So I went out in practice, and it was dismal. The engine was dismal. I was second to last, and I was probably 5 seconds off the pace. It was awful. And I was driving it hard. I have pictures in here where I'm overdriving the car in the corners, trying to make up for the lack of power of the engine.
Yeah.
And the upshot was I got into the race with the car, but in fact, I was 22nd again, 22nd out of 25. And during the race, I was coming out of a very, very fast corner down the straight. As I popped the brakes on, I just looked to make sure nobody was there to see flames coming out of the back of the car. And there was no indication on any of the instrumentation, but basically what had happened, the dry sump pump of the engine on the BRM engine had an aeration unit on it. There was a scavenge pump, and it was so complicated. The aeration unit was to get rid of the air out of the oil to stop it foaming, and the scavenge pump was obviously to take the oil out of the engine. Mm-hmm. Well, the scavenge side had broken, and therefore the oil pressure was perfectly fine, but as I was going along, the engine was filling up with oil until it just burst. It just burst the engine, all the seals and everything, which caught fire on the rear brakes. And so I was out of the race. We went to Brazil for the next race a week later with the other engine in, which was even worse. But funnily enough, I still qualified 22nd. And
lucky 22nd.
Yeah. So 3 races, and I've been 22nd on the grid in all of them. And sadly, all in Duff cars, I'm afraid, as much as I love Mo Nunn. At least I did get to qualify his car, but it still wasn't a competitive motor car.
Yeah.
So we get to Brazil. I qualify. We go into the race, and I'm dicing with a German called Rolf Stommelen, who was driving for Graham Hill in the Lola, and Wilson Fittipaldi, who was in the Coppa car. And it was quite funny, actually, because this was the old Interlagos circuit. As I was going down the straight, you could see people's arms waving through the fences. When Wilson was in front of me, they were all thumbs up. Everything was great. When I overtook Wilson, all I got was fists shaking at me as I went down the straight. But sadly, again, halfway through the race, the engine failed. But it didn't actually go bang. Part of the clutch broke, and the ignition pickup for the V12 is off the flywheel. And as this piece of metal flew around inside the bell housing, it smashed the ignition pickup off it. So the upshot was I got back to England, having had 2 retirements and the car being really not very competitive, to be summoned by Mr. Stanley for a meeting, to be bawled out that I really wasn't driving the car very well and I was too slow. And, so I said to him, I really wanted to be in Formula. I wanted to get more competitive. I said, look, if you look at my corner times, they really are very good. But when you look at the time it takes me to get from that corner to the next one, the car is definitely lacking in power. What I want us to do is to get a Cosworth DFE engine, put it in the back of a P201. It would be reliable for a start, and it would also probably give us nearly 100 more horsepower. He went absolutely berserk, and he fired me on the spot, saying that he would never put an American engine in a British BRM. Yeah. And I tried to explain that it was built by Mike Costin and Keith Duckworth at Cosworth in Northamptonshire, in Northampton. It's a British engine. He said, it's not a British engine. It has Ford on it because Ford put up the money for the engine, therefore it's American. And we never spoke again. I walked out of his office and he tore up the contract, which he actually paid me £1 for to make it legal. And that was the end of my Formula One, sadly.
Oh.
I couldn't get back in anyway. I tried hard, but I couldn't.
Yeah. Well, it didn't. Luckily, it didn't stop your journey on motorsport, though. I think, did it? Because obviously, you went on to do numerous different championships and different cars from there. I think you've been around Le Mans quite a few times on the 24-hour. Is that right?
Yeah, that was probably one of my all-time favourite races. I was lucky enough to. I have a friend called Ray Mallet, and Ray talked to a man called Hugh McCaig, who was resurrecting a Kyrgios.
Is it Scottish? Are they right all the way up north? Is that right?
Oh, yes. Yeah, it was an Edinburgh-based racing team by David Murray back in the day. They won Le Mans with D-type Jaguars in the 50s.
Right.
And Hugh was going to bring the Kyrgios back to international motor racing. And I did a race with Ray Mallet. He was a friend, or he still is a friend. He had Jeffrey Marsh's Lola T280 with a DFE in the back, and there was a Thunder Sports race at Donington. And he said, would I like to share the drive with him? It was a long distance race. So I agreed and went to Donington, and the car had to be brimmed with fuel because we didn't have any refueling equipment in the pit, so we would start the race with full tanks. And Ray said, you do the start and I'll do the finish. So I said, okay. I was on the front row of the grid with a Can-Am Lola T530 Falston's car. I could smell petrol. And Ray said, well, don't worry. He said, where the top of the tank is, it has a rubber gasket, and I think it's just seeping a little out of there. But, a couple of laps, the car only does 4 miles to the gallon. It'll be well away from that. I trust Ray implicitly. Love him to bits. He's a brilliant engineer. So fine. it was a hot day, but I still had all my fireproof underwear and 3-layer Nomex and my balaclava on and everything. So off I went. I led the race for the first 12 laps, being pressured by this Lola T530. And at the start of the 13th lap, I put the brakes on down to Redgate, turned into Redgate, accelerated hard out. And of course, a DFV engine car gets you going towards Craner Curves very quickly. I looked to my left and I could just see a hint of some smoke. And I thought, I wonder what that is. At that moment, the whole car exploded. By all accounts, for some reason, the fuel tank was leaking outside of the bag tank into the monocoque itself. And some of it had managed to get out of the monocoque to the left front disc, catch fire, come back in, and the whole thing exploded. I've got an absolutely amazing photograph of the car as it exploded. I think it's the only time I've ever thought that I was going to die in a racing car. Because by this time I was probably doing 130 miles an hour down towards Craner. I knew I had to get it stopped. I knew I had to get away from it. And I think what saved my life was that in the front of my brain, the pain of sitting in this fire, I can't tell you how bad it was. And of course, it got worse the slower I went. Suddenly, I was absolutely in the whole thing. And I thought, if I breathe in, I'm going to scorch my lungs and it's going to kill me. So I held my breath for as long as I could. And my crash helmet was now on fire, so I couldn't see out. I couldn't see through the fire. And I couldn't see to fire the extinguishers. And everything I undid my belts, and everything I was trying to push when the car was almost stopped was melting. I just couldn't get the leverage to get out, and it was a nightmare. I thought, I'm going to die in here. But I did manage to roll out of the car and roll round and round and round on the floor because it was hurting so much. I was burning. And that was that. I was taken off to hospital, and Ray went home with the car, and he covered it with diesel oil from the transporter. And 3 weeks later, it was racing again with somebody else. But that, I think, joined Ray and I together, because as soon as they were looking for a driver for the Acura Cross team, Ray said, you should get Mike Wilds in the car. So I then drove for them for 4 years, 1984, 85, 86, and 87. I'd done Le Mans a couple of times before. I drove it in 1981 for a Swedish team in a Porsche 935, in a what they called a baby 935. It was a Kramer car with a 1.4 litre turbo, but it had immense horsepower. Wow. Quite incredible. But that sadly melted a piston during the race. Then I drove a Dorset Racing Lola in 1982. I missed 83, and then I drove 84 with Acura Cross, 85, 86, and 87. Retired in all of them with mechanical failures. I did have one accident which was repaired when poor Joe Gartner got killed at Le Mans. I hit his oil and went off and had quite a big accident, and then was hit by Jochen Mass in the Rothmans Porsche. He hit the same oil, then hit me. And so the car was in a bit of a state, but we did manage to get it repaired, but it failed. We had a tyre failure, which smashed all the radiators and stuff, and we were out. And then I drove a works Nissan with Win Percy and Alan Grice in 1988, which is probably the fastest I've ever been. We did about 238 on them also, and then because there were none of these silly little chicanes.
Wow. Well, I can't imagine what it's like. 200 miles an hour plus on the track must be phenomenal. I mean, especially from where you started as well. And that's quite different.
I think this, when you start, my little DRW probably did 100 miles an hour or just over, and your brain gets used to that. Then you get in another car that does 150 miles an hour. It seems a little bit quicker, but then the brain gets used to it. I have to say, every time I got to Le Mans, every first practice session when I went out, it felt really fast, not to lift the throttle at the King. You're approaching it at, even the Acosta was doing 215 for a Group C2 car. Your right foot always wants to have a lift before you go into the King, but it is easy flat. But and in the end, during the race, you're going through two abreast. It's not a problem, but it takes a little bit of time for this just to get back to get back into the swing of it. So we tested it at Silverstone, but of course at Silverstone, the maximum speed we could probably get was about 170 to 180 down towards Stowe on the straight. We didn't have a long enough straight to test the top speed. So when we got there in 1984, I was the most experienced of the drivers. So they said, Mike, you go out and do an installation lap, which I did. Then went out and they said, do a few laps. And Ray had worked out with tyre growth and what have you, we'd be doing about 200 miles an hour at 8,000 RPM on top. So on the third or fourth lap, I come out of Tete Rouge and I go onto the straight and I just sit here flat. And the car was lovely. You could take your hands at 200 miles an hour, you could take your hands off the steering wheel. It was such a stable car. And I was, this is just great. I just saw the rev counter going higher and higher and higher. It got to 8 and it went through 8 to around 215 miles an hour. And I thought, this is fantastic. When there was the biggest bang I've ever heard. And at that speed, it's scary. And the whole car filled with dust. I didn't know what had gone on. I couldn't see very well because of all the dust. So I thought, I don't do anything. I just lifted my foot gently off the throttle. And as the dust cleared, I didn't want to move the steering wheel. I didn't want to touch the brakes or anything. It was still going in a straight line with this immense noise around it. And as it slowed down, because when you think, oh, that's good. You're still doing 150 plus miles an hour because it feels so much slower. And I started to look around. I touched the brakes worked okay. Our throttle was okay. Steering was okay. But there was this immense noise. And I looked around, and as I looked right, there was nothing there. The door, the bodywork and everything had exploded out. All I can explain to you the feeling is if you were sitting in an immense balloon and somebody burst it, the change in pressure and the explosion of it, it was just an aerodynamic thing. We were going so quick that the air pressure inside the car and the flow of air over it just burst the car.
Wow.
Just burst the car. Wow. So we got it repaired, and we had to drill lots of holes in the windows of both doors and so on to relieve the pressure. And we didn't have any more problems after that. But it was a scary moment.
Gosh. Is that sort of before the days of sort of aero and messing around with air tunnels and that sort of thing? I suppose the testing was literally you go and drive at 200 miles an hour and see what happens.
Yeah,
that's right.
See if it blows up or falls apart.
Right. Yeah, that's right. The Nissan in 1988 was another thing. It was 15 odd miles an hour faster than the Acosta on the straight. However, it was probably the worst racing car I've ever driven. And purely because the engine had so much power, it was amazing. We raced with probably 850 brake horsepower, and in qualifying it was touching on 1400 brake horsepower.
Jeez.
But like a switch, there was no, you drive a Porsche 956 as I do in historic races now. The power delivery is beautiful. Even the gearbox has got synchro mesh, but this Nissan was brutal. You had 450 horsepower. You suddenly saw the boost gauge do that, and it doubled. So it was very difficult to drive smoothly, and in the wet, it was a nightmare.
Yeah.
But on the straight, it had the worst bump steer of any car I've ever driven. I don't know if you sort of understand the implications of that, but going down the straight, there was a few bumps in the road. You just didn't know whether the car was going to turn left or right. And really, you don't need this in a 24-hour race, especially where the straight...
It's going to keep you awake.
Yeah.
The straight is where you sort of have a nice relaxing time. You just sit there with your foot on the floor and, that's great, and get ready for the rest of it. So we spoke to the Japanese engineers and mechanics, and they were always saying, yes, no problem, we get that fixed. Wilds saying, yes, we get that fixed. That happened all week, and we got into the race and the car was exactly the same. And you know, that bastard thing finished. We were running quite well, but we did have a gearbox problem that lost us 40 minutes. We went back to 33rd and got back to 14th.
Not bad going. Christ.
Yeah.
Mike, I'm keen to take us back round to Porsche again, and your sort of your relationship with Porsche, and when did that start for you, and what sort of parts of your career have sort of touched on Porsche along the way?
Well, I've always had a passion, an absolute passion for Porsche. Every Le Mans I drove in, I'd look up the pit lane and wish I was driving a Porsche. I only managed the 935, but where the passion came from originally was when I was back working for Firestone in the late 1960s, early 1970s. I made friends with a Swiss racing driver called Joe Siffer. And Joe was a works Porsche driver at the Targa Florio, and I was down there working as an assistant race tyre engineer, doing tyre pressures and temperatures and so on. And Joe was driving a Porsche 908 Mark III at the Targa. He had a little company car. It was a 911T. And instead of going back with the guys from Firestone one day from the circuit to the hotel, Joe offered me a lift in his 911. And he said, what we'll do is we'll go around the circuit. The circuit had been reopened as a public road, 34 odd miles of public road. And we howled around the Targa in this 911. He drove it beautifully. And I vowed that day that I would have a 911 in my life. Yeah. With a wife, 2 children, and being paid not an immense amount of money for driving racing cars. I earned a living, could pay my mortgage, everything was fine. And I learned to fly, and that's great. But I never got my 911 until 22 years ago. I didn't want a standard 911. I wanted a lightweight 911, and I couldn't afford a 2.7 RS. So I started to look for a 1988 911 Club Sport, so that that would sort of fill my desire for a lightweight in one way. And of course, I couldn't get anybody to sell me one. And I wrote and rang all the people on the register, but nobody would. But one man I knew was a man called Chris Phillips, and he raced at the time Chevron B8, I think. And he had a lovely 911 CS Club Sport. But it was immaculate from what I remembered. I hadn't seen it for a year or more. But he phoned me one day and said, "You still looking for a Porsche?" And I said, "Yes." He said, I want to buy an AC Cobra to race, and I'm a bit short on the funds, so would you buy it? So stupidly, I didn't even ask the price. I said, I'll have it. Because I knew it was one of only 53 right-hand drive models that they made. And I went over to Bedford, where he lived, and it was really a really nice one. And he wanted £26,000 for it. Chrissy and I had £13,000 worth of savings, and that was it. So I said to Chrissy, can I use all the savings, and can I borrow £13,000 from the bank and buy this car? And again, she was, and bear in mind, we've got 2 children, a mortgage, and all the rest of it. And so I ended up with the Porsche on my driveway and not a single penny in the bank. But I've still got it.
That turned out to be quite a shrewd investment, I think.
Yeah, it's worth about 30,000 now, I think.
I'll come round and buy it tomorrow.
There'll be an orderly queue.
Yes.
Well, I had it valued a year ago. I have to always get it valued for the insurance.
Yeah.
And the last one was not far short of 200. So it was very pleasant to hear that. And I know some have sold at auctions for 160 or so.
Yeah.
But this one it drives like a new car. It's absolutely wonderful. And
Do you still get much time in it? Do you still drive it?
I do.
Yeah.
I know I'm not starting. I was out in it yesterday.
Wonderful.
And my E-Type, which is another car I'd always wanted. But my passion for Porsche stemmed from Joseph at that day. And I'm delighted that I'm now racing a Porsche in the Peter Auto Classic Series. I'm racing the Porsche 956 chassis number 101, which was the first customer car that Porsche sold to Kramer in 1983.
Wow.
And they put Mario Andretti, Michael Andretti, and Philip Alliot in the car at Le Mans, and it came third at Le Mans in 1983. And I drove it once at a Group C demonstration at Goodwood. And the man I drove for, Paul Andrews, decided to sell it last year. And a German called Rainer Becker, who's a big Porsche man, he's got a 910, a 904, a 500, a 356, he and a 74 RSR. He loves his Porsche. And because he bought this car, luckily, Trevor Crisp, who runs it, said, look, you really need somebody you've never driven an aero or ground effect type car before. You need somebody to drive with you. They're 2-driver races.
Yeah.
So luckily they called me and I had a meeting with Ryan. We got on like a house on fire and we actually raced it together at Monza last year. Sensational car.
Wonderful.
Sensational. I'm really glad now because I'm 75. I'm really glad they're not too long a races because I forgot how physical Group C cars are and how much G they pull. And going through the parabolica in fourth gear at Monza with hardly any braking was really tearing the old neck muscles.
I bet, yeah.
But I can't tell you how much I enjoyed it. As I said to Ryan, it made me feel alive again. Yeah. You know, I'm getting in it to be an old man and I sit around thinking, oh, my life's over. Oh, okay. You go and drive a 956 Porsche and suddenly you're an 18-year-old again.
So how would you describe the drive on that car? I mean, how can you even begin to summarize that for somebody who's never sat in one?
It's very hot. It's quite noisy. It's very heavy on the steering. Mm-hmm. So it's good to have reasonable arm muscles and shoulder muscles and neck muscles, but they are easy to drive because you have a synchronous gearbox, which is unheard of really in a racing car, but it was built to be an endurance racing car. So Porsche did really well, I think, for putting a synchromesh gearbox on it. Okay, you can't snick it through like you can with a Hewland, a dog boxed. But so you take your time changing gear, but it's smooth as silk. As I said to you when I was talking about the Nissan with its dreadful power delivery, the Porsche, you start to accelerate and we were revving to just under 8, I think, to keep the longevity of this historic motor car. But we're revving around 8,000 RPM and it just pulls beautifully and it just keeps pushing you in the back. And you just pull another one, it pushes you in the back. You pull another one, pushes you in the back. The grip level, okay, when you'll see, if I send you these onboard shots, out of the slower corners, it does light up the back tyres and you get a tiny bit of oversteer on occasion. But I mean, the back tyres are huge. Front tyres are huge. No power steering, hence the big, and I sit very close to the steering wheel so you can use everything. And when you're in the parabolic, you can lock your arm, your elbow in because the G-force and so on. You really want to lock yourself there. And you'll see all this on the video. So the power delivery is great. The car goes where you want it to go. The gearbox is like a road gearbox. And there are no downsides to the car. It has to be, the 956 and the 962 have to be a pair of the greatest racing cars ever built.
Just beautiful looking things as well, aren't they?
They are, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I drove 935s, the big 935s with the 3 litre or 3.3 litre twin turbo engines. They were really brutish. And they had 4-speed gearboxes. It was like changing gear with a tractor. You know, they were wonderful cars. Wonderful cars.
I've just had a quick read up on the 956, 800 kilos, a 2.65 litre turbocharged flat six, developing 635 horsepower, and the very first dual clutch gearbox.
Yeah.
Just a few little tidbits there because I didn't know the history of them that well. So yeah, very interesting.
Yeah,
great to hear.
We're running around 650 brake horsepower with it, and I think for qualifying, the works Porsches would twist the boost gauge, the boost knob, and would put it up to an awful lot more than 650. But we definitely raced at 650, I'm sure.
In the historic series, are people still racing competitively, or is it more for show, do you think, these days?
No, there's it's competitive.
It is.
Reiner is a competitive man. He wants to look after his car, which I think
is
a
fine line there with historic, isn't it?
Yes.
It's a real difficult one.
I think there are a lot of people who get their elbows out, and I think it's wrong. They should be more demonstration than aggression.
Yeah.
But there are still, sadly, there was a man who overtook Reiner at Monza who got alongside and just pushed him out of the way, which is not on.
Yeah.
He got a lovely 962. But Reiner just overtook him again because the guy can't drive. But it's not. it's not good. It should be. People should have respect, especially in this type of motor racing. Reiner probably spent a lot of money on buying this car, and it's fair play to him that he wants to bring it out. He wants to use it. He wants people to see it and appreciate it.
Yeah.
And you don't really need to go out there with people who are not in the same mindset.
Yeah. No, it's a difficult one. I'll bring it. I think something we get asked an awful lot, which it might be a good time to ask the question, is so an awful lot regularly we get asked the question of people that want to get out on track in their Porsche, and we're talking everyday road going Porsches. What would be your sort of tips or recommendations if someone's thinking about it, and do they need to do much to their sort of road going Porsche before they go and sign on and have a go?
Well, I do a lot of instructing in Porsches. I seem to have got a reputation for being a Porsche instructor. In fact, my sadly missed friend Sean Edwards and I used to go and instruct with Porsche customers regularly, and he used to give me some of his customers if he was double booked, and I'd do the same to him. So I do understand the dynamics of Porsches, mostly 911s, GT3s and GT3 RSs and so on. I did race. I did a cup car race, a British Championship round in 2018. Frightened me to death. Hooligans. I had to jump in as a 73-year-old man, the oldest man ever to drive in Carrera Cup, and the car was sensational. But I had to change my driving style, which was very difficult to do in a weekend. But I wasn't last.
Elbows your way through.
But I would encourage anybody who owns a Porsche to do track days, especially if they were a little worried. Just go to a Porsche Club, Great Britain track day, because people seem to have respect. They all have a passion for the marque. I wouldn't go to a general track day, to be honest, because there are some numpties on there, and I would steer well clear. But if you've had your car serviced, if you have standard disc brake pads, it might pay to get a slightly upgraded set of brake pads together with some higher boiling point brake fluid, reasonable tyres, but just go do it. Porsches are amazing cars. I take my little CS on track. I don't drive it incredibly quickly, but I like just to stretch its legs, and it does no harm to the car whatsoever. You can drive very quickly with mechanical sympathy. You don't have to leave the braking to the very last minute.
Yeah.
You don't have to get the car sideways everywhere. There is a technique to driving a 911 quickly. And that's why I probably get quite a lot of business, because a lot of people don't know the technique of how to drive a 911 quickly. If I could say one thing to anybody who's watching this, who has a 911, to stay safe driving a 911 on track, when you're approaching a corner, just take a little bit more speed off than you think you need to. But once you've got the car turned into the corner, actually start to squeeze the throttle on. It brings the rear roll center of the car down. You press the throttle down as though you have an egg underneath it. You want to press the throttle down without breaking the egg. But if you do that from the point of turning, it won't cause the car to understeer. It won't cause the car to oversteer if you've gone in too quickly and raised the throttle to try and overcome that problem. So give a little to gain a lot, i.e. break a little speed off and then just drive the car through, and the Porsche will be one of the best handling GT cars you've ever driven if you drive it properly.
Yeah. I do say that the sort of cheapest way to get the top performance is sort of driver's instruction rather than trying to take the car to the next level. It's actually to get some instruction.
It is really, it's cheap performance, and it's a cheap way of keeping yourself safe. And because of, I can only really speak about myself, but the technique I use to teach people to drive is so mechanically sympathetic, and also sympathetic to the driver, because you're not absolutely knackered by the time lunchtime comes. You could do it all day. You can practice it. You can practice it when you're going fast. You can practice it when you're going off the pace. The technique doesn't change.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, you might spend a few £100s on a day's tuition with an instructor, but it'll save you thousands in mechanical sympathy.
Yeah.
And it'll make you a far safer driver. So you're not going to hurt yourself or anybody else on track.
I definitely vouch for that, because you might remember, Mike, we've got a little silver Cayman that we run as a track car, and it's been to a few track days, and you've sat in a few times, and actually exactly what you just described there, transformed our days from the morning session to the afternoon session. 10 minutes of your time and a few pointers, it's incredible, the difference that can make. And I really, really did feel that.
That's very kind of you to say so.
And then the next step on from that, I think maybe you then said, let me take a few laps in our car, and I sat in the passenger seat with you, and I had to change my underpants after those laps, because you definitely showed me that we don't need to spend another penny on the car. We just need to learn to drive it better.
Bless you. It is a fascinating art to drive quickly, and this is why. I mean, I've been teaching on track since 1970 as a sideline to my motor racing, and it is an art form. It's a fascinating thing, and I never get fed up with it, which is why here I am at 75, still loving to do it. I love to help people. I love to see a driver improve, and it doesn't take a lot to actually improve a road driver to make him pretty good on a track.
Yeah. Excellent.
It sticks in my mind those laps that I did with you, and how relaxed and composed you were, and how you're sitting with some people and they're pulling at everything. They're very aggressive, very quick and frantic, and you're incredibly relaxed. And the car was we went past everything, literally everything on the track, and there was all sorts of hot Porsches and all sorts of other stuff there, and it was just dancing past everything, and it was quite incredible to see that level of just jumping in a car you've not been in before, and just making it do that was absolutely incredible to see.
It's very kind. It's experience, but even not having experience, if you just know, as you said, a few pointers can suddenly transform you and you can relax. And a huge part of it is relaxation. If you're tense, the car will react to your tension and won't give you half the performance from the suspension and so on. If you're just gripping the steering wheel, if you don't allow that geometry to work through the front suspension, you won't get the performance out of the car that you should. If you ever sit with me again, look at my hands. I only ever use my fingertips.
I remember that, actually. It was the touch was barely there almost, but it was amazing, the responsiveness by doing that.
Yeah, the car will do its job far better. You can't do that with the 956.
No, I can imagine.
To actually move
wrestle.
But even that, you do it in a way. The suspension doesn't move like a road car moves. It's fairly solid, but you still try and do it in a way that is as smooth as possible. Then the car will do its job better.
Yeah, rather than taking it by the scruff of its neck.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it amazes me. I go to some track days and work for a track day company, and that track day company will offer my services free of charge. And yet I can probably sit around half the day and nobody bothers. And it does. It does. Well, I'm not sure what it does really. It amazes me, I suppose, that whether it's a male ego or what, I don't know, but I would want to learn from somebody who's experienced to help my driving.
Christ, I'm always happy to take all the help I can get because I know I need it. But I think you're right. It's an ego thing because track days are there's a lot of ego there anyway. And I think people sort of they assume they're the best driver already. They don't need to be told anything, don't they? It's a common thing, and you can spot those cars going around a mile off, can't you?
Yeah, you can, and it's quite hilarious sometimes.
So what would your top pointers be for a newbie for a track day? Obviously, take some instruction.
Yes, if you can't afford one-to-one, so you can't afford to phone Mike Wilds and say, come and teach me for the day, wherever you go on to a track day, the first thing you do is, well, in fact, prior to going, phone the track day organizer and get a session booked with the TDO's instructor.
Yeah.
If for any reason their book's solid, they always do some sighting laps. After you've signed on, say to the organizer, if you can't get any instruction, go and see them and say, can I sit with the instructor doing the sighting laps? Because then at least I do it all the time. Somebody will sit next to me on the sighting laps, and I just talk to them and tell them what I'm doing and show them the lines that I want them to try and take. And it's nice in that we do it at 50, 60 miles an hour. So it's very relaxed, and they can learn a lot, even in the 3 laps that we would do. So that's an essential, because it's no good doing it later in the afternoon because you've wasted all that time. You need to do it first thing and then practice it during the day.
What in the real world we're living in now, what does your 2021 look like? Is there a schedule of events, or is it all on hold for now?
It's looking really good.
Oh, excellent!
If we can do the races, I've already had, I think, Spa in the 956 taken away. I think that's going to be cancelled. And Reiner was going to let me race his 74 RSR at that meeting as well. So that's
wow.
I was looking forward to that.
Yeah.
So we've got a limited season. I think we're going to do Le Mans Classic. So I will have to remember that there are chicanes now down the Mulsanne Straight. Otherwise, I'm just going to sit there and say, well, this is just flat forever. So we do Le Mans, and hopefully we'll go back to Monza as we did last September. There is a series in this country and in Europe called the Masters Series. It's run by a man called Ron Maiden. And Ron has a few nice racing cars, one of which is a little Ginetta G4R that raced at Sebring in 1964. It's got a twin cam 1700cc Ford engine on twin Webers. And he's been trying to get me to drive it for some years. And it never, for some reason, it just, dates didn't work out or whatever. And I drove it at Donington and Brands Hatch last year for the first time. And the car is hilarious. It's wonderful fun. It's in a Masters sports car series. I think it's called Gentleman Drivers. And there's Ford Daytona Cobras, lightweight E-types, Lotus Elan 26Rs, and so on. And even on the Grand Prix circuit at Brands, I was running 4th overall and trying to get past these Cobras. And it really upsets them.
I bet.
Ginetta is all over them, and I think it's wonderful. I love being in little cars beating all the big cars.
Yeah.
And, so I did that at Donington and Brands. We finished 3rd, I think, at Donington. I had a coil failure at Brands when I was just about getting to 3rd overall. So I've got that. I've got Reiner, and I'm doing a 3-hour race in an Aston Martin Project 214 in the first weekend in May at Donington. I think a 3-hour with the owner. So I've got a fair bit to do if I can get to do them. But obviously my prime drive is with Reiner in the 956 and hopefully the RSR.
Yeah. Wow, that's quite a schedule for what could have been a stalled year. So yeah, fingers crossed that all happens for you, because that'd be a great lineup.
Thank you. Yeah, and I hopefully will start instructing soon.
That looks like it's going to be kicking off again soon.
Yeah. It looks like track days are back on. I've seen a few emails flying around already, so that's good news.
Yeah, so hopefully I'll have a nice busy time. I can't think of retiring yet.
No, not quite yet.
Go on.
Is there a car or an event that you would still like to tick off the list? So something that you haven't driven or done?
Something I haven't driven, yes, big time. I had a bucket list with lots of really nice cars on, and luckily, funny enough, while I was writing my book the other day, I thought I ought to have a list to go in the back of the book of the cars I've raced or tested, and I got up to 140, and I still think there's some that I've missed. But I always wanted to drive things like 250F Maserati, GT Works, GT40, Ferrari 512LM, P3, Williams FW07, all these sort of, and I've driven or raced them all. The only one I haven't is a Porsche 917. I'm desperate to drive. I've driven a replica, but I've never driven an actual Porsche 917, which is the last one of the big list of on my bucket list that I haven't driven.
Okay. Tell you what, if we've got a listener base that might know someone that knows someone with a 917 that Mike can get his legs into, I'm sure we can make that work. So let's throw that out there to the world and see what happens. You never know.
Oh, bless your heart. Yeah, that would be even if I just let the clutch out in first gear and stopped again. That would at least that would do. But with regard to what I would love to have driven in period a competitive Formula One car to see if I could have forged a career as a Formula One driver.
Yeah.
I probably, if I had a fault back in those days, I'm a bit better now because of my experience, but I probably wasn't quite as consistent as I should have been in my lap times. Now, I can drive laps at Le Mans, for instance. I could drive laps of 8 miles within 1 or 2 tenths. And I could do it lap after lap after lap after lap. Yeah. And I still can do it today. I'm very, very consistent now, and touch wood, reasonably safe. Even I do have the odd flying off onto the grass occasionally, but if I'm trying too hard for qualifying. But with regard to an event, I always had a thing about the Nürburgring. I went there in the early 70s in a hire car, and I went round and round and round, and then I tried to drive a Formula One car around there, and it frightened me so much I thought I could literally die that day. I didn't go back for 20 odd years. And I did go back in a sports car, and I love it to bits. I think I would quite like to do a 24-hour race around the Nürburgring. That's probably a thing that gnaws at me that I didn't do.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Well, I definitely feel like we've only scratched the surface of your journey through motorsport, because it's quite incredible. And I actually I think we didn't actually touch on it at the top, but obviously you are on the process of writing a book, which I don't know what the timescale is for that coming out, but I think we'll all look forward to that. And I'm guessing that'll be a longer version to give us all the details in between.
Yeah, well, I hope so. It was people on social media really goading me into doing it. And then I thought about it, that I have 4 lovely grandchildren. I really would like them, when they grow up, to see what their granddad did.
Yeah.
And so that's really the motivation, is for my family, really. But if I did talk to some publishers, but they weren't interested because they say nobody knows who I am. And I quite understand that. I'm not a James Hunt or whatever that people in the street would know. But I think there are a fair number of motor racing followers that would possibly know who I am, that might be interested in having it. I don't want to make money out of it. I just, as I say, I want some copies for my family to have. And if ever anybody else wants them, I'll sell them for what it costs me to have them printed.
So, well, you definitely sold a couple more copies today. So,
yeah.
I think I've still got a fair amount of writing to do, and then got to knock it into shape. But hopefully it'll be before the end of this year, I would hope.
Oh, fabulous.
The way I'm writing at the moment, it might be next week.
Well, I think so. We always wrap up our podcast with a quick fire round of 10 Porsche related questions. Sure. So we're hoping you'd be happy to do the same for us.
Of course.
Excellent. Right, so we'll have a quick run through. So 10 questions from the top going down, Mike. So question number one is all Porsche related. So question number one, air or water?
Air.
Air. Favorite Porsche model?
911.
Yeah, that'll cover them all. Yeah, we'll take that.
Was that all?
I don't know if it's a bit specific. Might not be. Favorite Porsche color?
Ooh, that's difficult because I do have a fair amount of favourites. Even some of the really new ones I really like. But my CS is white with lovely red Fuchs wheels, so I had to say white.
Yeah, works. Who would be your ultimate Porsche icon?
Oh, there are several. If I had to go for one, I'd probably go for Brian Redline.
Excellent. This could be an interesting one for you, being that you've probably done all of them. But what's your favourite track?
Wow. In their modern guys or their old guys?
We'll take both.
I think I love Spa-Francorchamps. I went there in 1966 with Firestone and drove round it when it was 8.5 miles around. I saw Rodriguez in a 917 do in the drizzle a lap of 161 miles an hour. So that's very special.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So even the new one is
good. In relation to the wheel choice, sounds like you've answered it already, but to Fuke or not to Fuke is always one of our questions.
Oh, yes. To Fuke.
Yes. Following on from that, stock or hot rod?
Definitely stock.
Definitely stock.
Yeah.
Narrow or wide body?
That's really difficult. I'd probably go for wide body.
I'd imagine this is a rhetorical question, but you never know. Cars and coffee or a track day?
Think of my age. No, track day.
And in relation to the 911, are you a back seats man or are you a no back seats man?
No back seats.
No back seats. I like it. Right. Well, thank you very much. That is our quick fire 10 round of questions, which, a few different answers there, which is always good to see.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on tonight, Mike. It's been fantastic to hear all the stories.
Well,
yeah, amazing rundown.
Thank you for asking me. Sadly, I do have a load more, so we could carry on for ages, but you'll have to read the book.
Absolutely. Good sales pitch at the end there.
Love it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks again, Mike.
Thanks for asking me. See you soon, I hope.
Well, what a story that was.
Yeah, crazy stuff in there, isn't there? I mean, what a lifetime of motorsport. I mean, it's every young boy's dream, surely.
Absolutely. Amazing how he sort of came from nothing as well and was very fortunate to meet some great people that helped him along the way. Yeah, it's a fantastic story.
I think it just goes to show, isn't it? If you really want something badly enough and you're willing to do whatever it takes to get there, then it is possible, isn't it? I mean, you look at things he's done. The list is endless.
Yeah, so much stuff. Yeah, it was really enjoyable. Thank you for coming on, Mike. It's much appreciated. And hope to see you in the passenger seat teaching us how to drive. Excellent. Right. Just got a quick Patreon update. We've got a new Patreon, Jim Gaffney from North Wales. He's got a 1985 3.2 Carrera and he sponsored us a beer.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. Any other news from you, Joe?
I think there is this week. It's obviously we're still in the realms of lockdown, but nothing very exciting to report. But I think there's a glimmer of hope coming, isn't there? So looking forward to roads being open fairly soon.
Absolutely. Let's sign out.
You've been listening to Road to Redline, the #1 Porsche and Car podcast fueled by our generous Patreons. If you'd like to join in supporting the podcast, please see patreon.com/Road to Redline and find us on Instagram.